Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion this morning about racism and economic opportunity in Greater Boston. Many of us in the business community are asking, what can I do about it? And others are asking the business community, what are you going to do about it? In my conversations over the past few weeks with people, black and white, some are saying listen, some are saying speak, some are saying act. All are saying justice, and all are saying change. I want to get to the speakers quickly, but I want to first offer a few personal reflections. George Floyd was murdered by a police officer, and that is a horrifying video to watch and to replay in my head. Yet I know that pain is incomparable to what our Black colleagues are experiencing. I know that George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery were tragically not the first. Racism and racist acts are not new in this country, not new in Boston, and we have a lot more to learn about that history. But this movement are different. Different in the depth and the breadth of reaction, different in the diversity of the response, and different in the diversity of the calls for justice and change. Have I done enough? Has the chamber done enough? Has the business community done enough? The evidence speaks for itself. The answer is no. Organizations of all kinds are issuing statements and making donations and taking those important, supportive first steps and the many steps toward meaningful action. But we need to get to the action and the change that has eluded us in the past. So let's have a conversation today and tomorrow and next week, and let's keep having a conversation so we can listen to each other and learn from each other. Let's work together to dismantle the duality of world that exists in educational opportunity, access to healthcare, wealth, and wage gaps. I know Boston's business leaders, black, white, brown, all races, and they know how to get the job done. When the people you are about to hear from create a goal or an objective, they are unwavering in their sense of purpose to achieve that goal. If there is an obstacle, they remove it. If there's a challenge, they face it. If there's an excuse, they refuse to accept it. In this moment, we need a collective, unwavering resolve from our business community leaders. We've all heard and read about the proposed solutions many times over the years. Talking about solutions is good, but let's also focus on the barriers, the obstacles, the challenges, the excuses in the way of realizing those solutions so meaningful change can take effect. How can the Boston business community lead in the path forward? What can we do? Let's have a conversation. I won't read through the speakers' bios so we can get started. If you'd like to learn more about our amazing guests, please click the link that will appear in the chat function at the bottom of your screen shortly. Please use that function to submit questions as well. We'll do our best to get to audience questions later in the program. And to our speakers, we have a large group. Please help our moderator by managing the time you take when speaking. And finally, this event is being recorded and will be made available on the Chamber's YouTube page. I'll return at the end, but to kick us off, please welcome our moderator and incoming chair of the Chamber Board of Directors, Micho Spring, chair of Weber Shandwick's Global Corporate Practice and New England president, and Ron O'Hanley, chairman and CEO of the State Street Corporation.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for the clarity of your statement. It certainly frames this discussion, which I'm really looking forward to, and I'm hoping that we can begin to move forward to having the business community have a key role in building a more racially and economically equitable society. So thank you, and welcome, Ron. Let's get right to you. Thank you, Ron, for your leadership, always, but particularly in this difficult moment.
Well, thank you for yours, Micho. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's start just with your reaction to the past few weeks in our country and in Boston. Certainly the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and then the subsequent protests in so many cities where you've got employees. What makes this moment, in your view, different? And why is this conversation so important now?
Well, I think Jim actually articulated it well at the beginning, and the way I would summarize that is enough is enough. Now, probably that conclusion is coming too late in the eyes of many, but the point is this cannot go on any longer, number one. Number two, I think there needs to be a recognition that this is our problem. Like we personally may not have caused it, but it's our problem to solve. And these issues of racism, which I believe is pervasive, are not going to be solved by leaving it to somebody else to do. It's a problem that we as a society have to take on, and the business community has a very important role, because without equality of economic outcomes, without real opportunity, without the ability of Black individuals, Black businesses to succeed and thrive, we're not going to solve this problem. That's not the only thing that needs to be done, but it's a very important first step that I think the business community needs to take on and acknowledge that it's our problem to solve.
Yeah, as Jim mentioned, companies are making statements, certainly listening to their employees, making donations as the first step towards meaningful action. State Street, notably, used your proxy voting power to push back against boards that lacked gender diversity. Can you talk a little bit about that achieve what you wanted it to achieve, and what lessons can we draw from that initiative and apply to achieving greater racial diversity?
Well, Micho, I think it's actually a great analogy. And what you're referring to is the fact that we're the third largest asset manager in the world. Much of that is in so-called index funds. So as a consequence, we own somewhere between 3 up to 18% of virtually every listed company in the world. It's a passive ownership, but we're not passive in our stewardship. And going back to the middle of the last decade, we started focusing on the area of governance and how these companies were being governed for the long term. And remember, we're long-term investors. As long as the company is in the index, we will own it. So we are the quintessential long-term investor, and we have a very strong belief that if you don't have good governance, if you're not environmentally responsible, if you're not socially responsible, that over the long term, this will erode value. I mean, you can always make the argument in the short term that for the next quarter, I'm not going to spend money on that, but that's irrelevant to us. We think of long-term value. And that focus on women actually worked. I mean, if you look at, not that we're where we need to be, but if you look at the progress that's been made in relatively short order in terms of women on boards, women in senior management roles, and we are committed to making that same kind of effort and same kind of stewardship in the area of racial equality and racial inclusion on boards and senior management teams. And again, it comes back to it's good for long-term value creation. The evidence shows that more diverse companies over time achieve better outcomes. And again, going back to it's our problem, this is uniquely part of our business, and therefore this is the lever that we can use to do our part in solving this problem.
What other levers do business leaders have in fighting racism?
So I think business leaders have a lot of levers here. And if you just think about diversity and inclusion in the workplace, I think that there's been a lot of focus on what I would call intake. I mean, let's be recruiting as much as we can, at least by some. I don't think there's been enough on how do you ensure that there's development and advancement. Do we really understand how to work across cultures and help people advance? I mean, that's been part of the whole journey for women, right? Men weren't working well with women, weren't sponsoring women, weren't allying with women. So we need to do the same thing there and really ensuring that there's advancement. It's like anything else. If you come into a place and you look around and there's nobody there that looks like you, there's nobody there that you can point to and say, I want to be like her, I want to be like him, that becomes a problem. And talented people don't want to be in a place like that. So that's one, but there's much more that can be done. And if you think about who you choose to do business with, a company like State Street, we literally have thousands of vendors, but we haven't done a good enough job in saying, do we really have enough minority and women-owned businesses as our providers? And have we really pushed hard enough to insist upon, when we're buying XYZ kind of service, can we look for vendors like that? So I think there's much, much more we can do. Lastly, people get a lot out of the workplace. I mean, again, if you look at who people trust institutionally, and we all talk about the erosion of trust in institutions, but people still have a high degree of trust in their employer. And so as employers, I believe we have a responsibility to take that trust and work with people to help them solve this problem for themselves, right? What do they need to do to be better in terms of addressing this kind of racism?
No, that's culture is really important in all this for
Mm-hmm.
sure. And I want to get to an issue that I know you're very concerned about, and that is the disproportionate impact that COVID had on small businesses, particularly those owned by women and minorities. And you showed enormous leadership, calling it together a group of Boston business and community leaders, including the chamber, to help these businesses in Massachusetts. Can you talk about what you're trying to accomplish, given the strong connection between economic and racial equality, and why this initiative is more important than ever?
Well, listen, I mean, small businesses are the driver of employment in this country. If you really look at where jobs are created, a firm like ours, we employ a lot of people, but our employment is actually quite flat. And it's been flat for years. We're growing, but we're growing our business, but we're also becoming more productive. The real driver of employment is small and medium-sized businesses. Even in a good year, the fail rate of small businesses is quite high. I mean, they're all entrepreneurial ventures. They all operate under different pressures. COVID-19 is an existential challenge to many small businesses in this state. These businesses aren't made to operate in a shutdown mode. They don't have the same kind of access to capital. They don't have the same kind of access to advice. And compounding this problem is that in this state, many other states too, but certainly in this states, small businesses are disproportionate employers of minorities and women. So there needs to be a way to help these businesses bridge to the other side. That bridge hopefully is going to be one where they'll come out of this economic shutdown and be able to get restarted, but it may be that they have to emerge in a different form, more digital, a different kind of business. So the whole purpose of Small Business Strong is working with leaders that already know how to do this and to try and leverage that to bring at a much higher velocity and volume expertise first to deal with the crisis, access to capital, fending off legal challenges, whatever. And then over the long term, how do we bridge to a new, different business model? So it's important that we do this. It's important that we nurture this small business community, and it's particularly important if you think about the challenge now that we have as we're having serious conversations about race in this country. If we're serious about this, we have to be committed to better economic outcomes, better healthcare outcomes, better educational outcomes, and small businesses are a big driver of that.
Well, we're lucky that you've jumped on this and you did it so quickly when this crisis hit. So hopefully it'll make a difference. Just one last question before we let you go. How have expectations of business changed while you've been CEO?
So expectations of businesses have changed. Certainly before I became CEO, it's been an evolving, but even more rapidly evolving movement towards this idea of stakeholder capitalism. And I want to be clear on that. Ultimately, as a CEO of a corporation, it's not my money. right? Shareholders and trust management to work on their behalf. But real success and long-term success here is not about just satisfying shareholders. It's not that easy, right? We've got the community, we've got our employees, we've got the environment, and it's that idea that it's no longer an or, it's shareholders or the environment, shareholders or racial justice. Everything's an and now. And that's something that not only should we live with, but we should seize the opportunity. You know, we are privileged to be in these roles, running these businesses, and we should seize the opportunity to be able to make an impact here.
Well, thank you. And thank you. Thanks State Street that has always played such a leadership role in this community on issues from education to gender equity and now helping us through this. So thank you.
Well, it's not just State Street. I mean, the great thing about this business community is there's extraordinary leaders, extraordinary institutions, also extraordinary not-for-profit leaders. So, and they're all in this together. And we're blessed to have a place like Boston to be able to deal with these problems.
I agree. Thank you. So thank you. So let's keep the conversation going. We're going to unmute everybody else magically. Can you unmute yourselves? Okay. We have a terrific range of talent on this panel, and so we're looking forward to getting to all of you. But Lee, let me start with you. As president of Emerson College, a respected leader in the city and a Black man, you decided to use your position in this moment to write about your personal experiences with racism in a very powerful way. On behalf of all of us, thank you. You taught us a lot. Thank you for sharing your story. Why did you think it was important at this time to share your personal perspective?
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I primarily wanted to make the invisible visible and to use the power of storytelling. And we all, of course, have stories to tell. To use the power of storytelling authentically and personally to show that privilege does not inoculate Black people from the vestiges of bigotry and structural racism that we all know is so deeply embedded in the American culture. My story is not an anomaly. It's as fresh and real and present as the very air that we all breathe. I also wanted to humanize Mr. Floyd and all of the Mr. Floyds that preceded him as a counterpoint to the cruel and casual dehumanization by a white police officer who kept his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until he cried out, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And finally he called out to his mama, who was already dead as he spoke his last breath.
Yeah, it's your letter, I think you've told me, has reached 8 million people on social media, and I can only imagine the impact you have had. So again, thank you. But in that letter, you said that Black Americans are invisible to most of white America. In Boston, we've had many conversations about whether or not lack of diversity in leadership positions is due to pipeline or it's versus people relying on their networks and giving opportunities to those they know. How do we change that behavior?
Yeah, well, let's just talk a little bit about the underlying issues here, and I think we're all aware of those. I mean, we're all in our walks of lives and businesses, we're aware of how unconscious bias breeds bigotry and racism. We also know that fear and ignorance, which is so prevalent today in certain parts of American society, that fear and ignorance is the most potent cocktail. But what we may not know or recognize is that structural racism creates, the way in which it creates the wealth gap, the achievement gap, the business opportunity gap, dining gap, the hiring gap, the contracting gap, the health gap, and so on. Every gap that you can imagine is rooted in American history from its very beginning. I think as awful as Mr. Floyd's death was, it is not the problem. It is a symptom of a larger problem that has been with this country, as I said, from its very beginning. The other thing that we know is that Mr. Floyd's death is not new. This moment is not new. And the cure is not new. So it's a matter of will. It's a matter of not seeing the tragic events. It's a matter of not seeing the tragic events as something to be fixed. I've heard that said over and over again. And that is an awful, awful mistake. Because what we need is a sustained effort, not to fix this as if it's going to go away, but a sustained effort. And we need continuous improvement in all walks of life. As I like to say, that excellence is not about being something. Excellence is about becoming something. It is always an aspiration, and we should see our orientation to these long-standing issues as a matter of aspiration and always, always moving forward. What will it require? Well, we all know it will require will, and it will require especially the will of those of us in power who already have a precious and cherished seat at the table of bounty. So people ask me all the time, is this the moment? Is this the wake-up call? I don't know. I thought Rodney King was the wake-up call. I thought that, 26 young kids from the ages of 5 to 6 murdered in their classrooms in Sandy Hook was the wake-up call. So I don't know. Let's meet again a year from now, and I think we'll all have a better sense of whether or not we've achieved what we wanted to achieve. So I want to call our attention to something, an op-ed that was in the Globe recently. It was called "How to Create an Inclusive Economy." The authors were Colette Phillips, Quincy Miller, and Daryl Settles, all of them Black leaders in our city. And what they said is, and I think it's right, there's an ecosystem here that needs curing and needs to be more healthy. That in government and businesses, we need to provide more contracting opportunities for owners of folks of color. We want to make sure that businesses owned by folks of color are a part of the supply chain, which they are often or not. Universities, of course, have a part to play to make sure that we're providing young people with access and affordability. Foundations have to step up. This is the moment for foundations to step up in a big way. Public education must step up. And we must, of course, attack the issues that create health disparities. So, the formulas are there, but it's a matter of will. And then I'll also just call out an organization with which I have some association. It's BECMA, the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts. It's an important, vital part of the business ecosystem, and I believe that it deserves broad and financial support from the business community.
Thank you, Lee. Marcy, you chair an organization that's very much part of that ecosystem, the partnership. You chair its board of directors, so you know firsthand that we don't have a pipeline issue. Why, despite the talent available in Boston and the countless professional development programs that exist, we have not made strides in achieving equal representation in management and leadership roles. What do you think are the obstacles?
I think we haven't met the strides for a number of reasons. And first, thank you, Micha, for doing this, and everyone who's on here. I think it's awesome that we're doing this conversation. But we haven't met those, we haven't made strides, I think, for a few reasons. First, people hire people who look like them, or who went to the same college as them, or were referred to them by a friend who also looks like them. That's one sad reason. Secondly, even though companies have diversity goals and targets, very few of them have targets that truly represent the actual makeup of the communities we serve. And when communities reach their mediocre targets, they claim victory for having met the goal, and they move on to the next challenge in their business life. And then I think a third reason why we haven't made strides is that there's unconscious bias all over the place. If an opening comes down to two equally qualified candidates, one white, one black, what we'll do is we'll say, well, the black candidate needs XYZ development in order to move on later, while we'll say the white candidate really needs that next opportunity for development. So we hire the white candidate. This is, of course, unless we haven't met those mediocre targets that I stated earlier, and then we hire the black candidate. I actually think it's as basic as that. And you didn't ask, but you mentioned the partnership, and I would say an easy way around all of this problem, or part of the problem, is to contact the partnership and put your jobs on the job board, where you will have access to excellent professionals of color. So those are a few reasons why, Micho, I think we haven't made strides.
Yeah, it's interesting because these incidents, these horrible incidents, have certainly brought the passion around this issue. But the Globe series now over a year ago certainly gave us the data, and we have not been able to move forward in a significant enough way. So the obstacles are I hope, Lee, that you're right, and that if we stay with it, we can actually make more progress. But Marianne, let me bring you into the conversation for welcome. And for over 600, for over a decade, over 600 Boston teenagers have been employed during the summer through John Hancock's MLK Scholars Initiative, which is the largest and most comprehensive corporate summer jobs program of its kind in the US. Can you tell us about the program and how it can be amplified for Black teenagers right now?
Well, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to be here, both to you, Micho, and Jim as well. You know, I think it's great to be able to listen to other people and learn and continue to learn. And a special shout out as well to Sheena, who's also on this call. She's been certainly a strong voice, and her leadership has been very instrumental in some of our past MLK Scholar leadership forums that we've had. You know, in normal times, summer jobs and internships like our MLK Scholars Program are really important pathways to economic self-reliance and professional growth for so many teens here in Boston. But unfortunately, these are not normal times. You know, the tragic killings that we've seen of men and women across the nation, the resulting protests, the COVID-19 and the impacts that it have is just really addressing a lot of the structural inequities that we really have across the country. And it starts, you know, with all of us putting equity at the forefront of everything that we do, especially in how we support young people. And, you know, the summer really is an opportunity for us to sort of redouble our efforts to ensure that that economic opportunity and summer jobs are available for young people from every corner of the city. And that's why, you know, we're so proud of sponsoring the MLK Scholarship Program. You know, we do that in collaboration with the City of Boston, the Boston University, the Boston Globe, and Partners Healthcare. And as you said, you know, we're helping 600 teens across Boston, Black and brown, trying to find jobs for the summer. And we invest about $1 million in order so that they can get meaningful paid job experience, but as well as help them with financial literacy and leadership development programs. And, you know, we're still trying to work out the details, as you can imagine. we're in a different world right now, and a lot of this has to be done virtually or with public health guidelines in place. But we think it's really important that this program is being embraced this summer, especially. I know we have 36 students that are joining us at John Hancock, and they're going to have to do so in a virtual way, unfortunately, because we're still primarily work from home at John Hancock. So I think we just all need to be flexible and creative in how we do this. And it's probably more important than ever that these summer opportunities are available for young teens in Boston. And we just got to continue to invest in the diverse talent slates, making sure that we're filling the pipeline, because it is going to benefit our organizations over the years ahead. You know, I'll just conclude by saying, you know, I'm very proud of the MLK Scholars Program that we have, and it's helping on the inequities in the city, but there's still a lot of work to be done. You know, we can and we must do better, all of us. And, you know, I look forward to working with many of you as we continue to redouble our efforts and really help to develop some solutions that are going to help us in the challenges that we face.
Thank you again, and thank you for your continued leadership. And this is a great segue to bring Sheena into the conversation. Beyond not being given the opportunities, we know that given Boston's reputation and the experience of many Black professionals, they don't view Boston as somewhere that they want to live or work. And you've built a business around creating community for Black people in Boston. Would you say this sense of belonging is what professionals are craving and missing from their employers? Is failing to recognize this by all of us, and missed opportunity to retain and advance talent?
Yeah, good morning, Micho. Thank you for that question, and thank you to good morning to my fellow panelists. So something that I've been noticing, something that happens time and time again in these conversations, and it's going on again now. Jim mentioned some of it in the beginning. So companies make external donations, they make statements. We start looking at our boards again. We might try to figure out if we can find some new Black vendors to buy from. All important things. However, what I think gets overlooked are the Black people that are right in front of us. So your employees in particular, you know, how are they feeling right now? What things have they been saying to you already that you've been overlooking and not listening to? Have you realized that they aren't really a part of the fabric of your company? And, you know, what attempts have you made to help them be connected to mentors that look like them, whether they're inside or outside of your company? And I urge, you know, everyone on here and who's listening, who has the opportunity to lead a company, whether as CEO or in other leadership positions, to really take an inward look to how are you supporting and developing talent and paying attention to the needs of the folks you already have, which will in turn help to attract the people that you want. Because we have many resources in the city. I mean, Boston's over-resourced, but I think what we don't really tap into, both as companies and as a city, your best ambassadors are gonna be the people that already work there or the people that already live here. They're the ones that, when I travel myself to Atlanta and people say, oh, you live in Boston, are there any Black people there? You know, that's my opportunity to either say, hey, no, I think this is somewhere you should come, or say, yeah, you're right. Like that's why I'm here this weekend, because I don't feel welcome in Boston. And so I think that there's a real opportunity. You know, Marcy referenced the Spotlight series, and it feels like it was a year ago because it's still very pertinent, but that was actually 3 years ago. That was 2017 that series came out, and we're still having this conversation. And I don't think that the city, the business community has really responded to that yet. I think it has tons of important data in it. I think it has amazing stories like Lee's story that he shared publicly, and we're still saying, you know, what do we do now? And so many of you all know I was at the Chamber for a number of years working on what is the business community's response to the lack of racial equity in the city. And I left as a full-time employee to focus on my venture, Boston While Black. And I felt like it had to be that bold for a couple of reasons. One, we've heard many terms like driving while Black or X while Black, you know, that have a negative connotation, and essentially is saying to the world, even whatever I'm doing as a Black person, it puts me in danger. And so I'm trying to reframe that and really have a different conversation around Boston, and how is Boston somewhere that people actually want to be. And so what it is a membership community for graduate students, entrepreneurs, and professionals who are new, are still learning to navigate Boston, but really looking for this thriving and connected community to say, how do we, one, build community here with each other, and how do we leverage each other to be able to move, not just professionally, but personally through the city, and make this somewhere that Black people actually see as a place where they can, not only get a great job opportunity, which kept me in Boston for many years, but buy a home and have a thriving social life. All things that as companies we may not think we should care about, but we know that people, particularly millennials and younger, choose a city and then they choose where they're going to work. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are in these positions to not only be thinking about, what is the statement our company is making, or what are the kind of outward activities we're doing, but how are we making our company somewhere where Black people can actually find community. If we don't have the workforce yet that we know we need to have, how are we making sure they connect to other Black people in the city? And how are we making sure Boston is somewhere that is truly welcoming to Black people? Sorry, I froze for a second. I don't know if you said something else, Micho.
No, we all froze, I think. So keep going. Keep going. Sheena, your voice is so important. Keep going.
That's the main piece of it. I mean, I'm fortunate, me personally, to be in this place where I'm connected to community of color in Boston, particularly the Black community, and connected to the business community, and able to be a bridge between the two. And I talked about this even with Jim and us preparing for this, we've had this conversation many times. And so how do we really listen and let Black people lead on these issues? Because we know what we need, we know what the city needs, and we need the opportunity, the resources, and the space to lead on it.
Well, thank you for your voice. You make an incredible, we're lucky to have you in this conversation and in the broader conversation in the city. So thank you for all you're doing and for the clarity of your voice. Anna, your work focuses on the intersection of not only being a Black woman, but also being a woman and the additional challenges that Black and other women of color face. Your annual conferences help to amplify the professional and personal experiences of women of color. Would you share what's emerged at these conferences as needs for this community, and that priorities that the business community should be paying attention to at this moment and in the future?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. And thanks for inviting me to the call. Before I speak about my conference, I do want to say and mention to the panelists as well as the people on the call that Black people are tired of being sick and tired. We've had these conversations numerous times, hundreds of years, decades going back. And at this point, I'm hoping that these conversations will actually result in all of us taking some action to remove these inequities that we are dealing with in this country. My husband, Emerson Foster, started the Men's Dinner Group over 20 years ago to bring men of color together because they did not feel like they were important in the city of Boston. With me, I started the Maven Conference 9 years ago. We'll be going on our 9th year in 2020. And in 2018, I took the conference nationally to 5 cities, reaching about 3,000 women nationally. And what I found, which is why I also started the conference, is Black women felt they just did not matter. So when I started this conference 9 years ago, it was to give Black women a seat at the Maven conference table. It started small at actually Darrow's. with a group of 30 women. And, you know, we just had conversations of what it felt like to be a Black woman here in Boston. So we actually get the double whammy of racism, of being Black, and the sexism. So we're really low on the totem pole. We get it all being Black women. And Black women did not feel that they had a community here, which is why I started it in 2011. Fast forward, I've sent out sponsorship decks trying to get different companies and leaders to jump on board and support this movement of Black women. We're doing personal and professional development and training at our conference. Over the years, I think over the last 3 years, Eastern Bank was the first one to jump on. Vertex jumped on, Gilead jumped on, Sodexo jumped on, and a few others. However, most of them wanted to put their money towards the mass conference for women, which is not really supportive of Black women. There was an article written about it in the newspaper last year. You know, so if we're really about being true allies and commitments, we need to really start walking the walk and not just talking the talk. You know, I'm happy to be on this call today, but I've been on calls every week, every month, you know, having the same types of discussions. We really need to push the conversation and move the needle forward. So yes, I do have the Maven Conference for Women. I'm going strong in 2020. I'm looking for signature sponsors. I'm looking for title sponsors. I'm looking for partnerships that actually believe that Black women can move forward and excel in Boston and actually commit to doing so. So that's a little bit about the work that I'm doing with A Maven's World.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you
You're
for
welcome.
your leadership. Let's talk about inequities, racial inequities in healthcare, Andrew. COVID-19 has certainly shown a light, not only in our deep economic inequality, but also racism in healthcare. What have been some of the obstacles to eliminating disparities in healthcare, and what are some of the tangible steps that insurers, providers, and even those outside of the healthcare system can take to remove them?
Thanks, Micho. First of all, I really want to attend to what Anna said and what Daryl Settles has said in the chat room about a lot of conversation, where's the action? And I think that's a helpful reminder to all of us. Racism is a public health emergency. Racism is a public health emergency. We've known, unfortunately, about deep racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare for decades. We've studied it. The evidence is clear that Black Americans, immigrants, and others have unequal access to healthcare, have higher incidences of some of the most prominent chronic diseases in the country, like heart disease and diabetes and cancer, and don't get equivalent treatment, even in some of our best institutions. So what we have to do is what some of our speakers so far have recommended have to get embraced by the healthcare field. First, diversity at the top of the house, on boards, on senior leaderships. I'm proud that at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, we have more than half our board and senior leaders are people, women and people of color. And it has to, as Marcy said, and Marcy is one of our board members, it has to flow throughout the entire organization. And you have to figure out how to develop and promote and support people of color in your organization. And we do that, but we need to do it even better. But healthcare also has to acknowledge more deeply this racism in the system. There was an article just this week in the STAT publication associated with the Boston Globe where a physician from San Francisco acknowledged, she said that I think healthcare is protected from the broader discourse because the narrative is we're all heroes. We don't actually address that the structure being perpetuated in healthcare is the same dynamic that's playing out in the criminal justice system. A kind of powerful statement. And so we have to take steps. We have to collect better data, self-identified data on ethnic and racial disparities. We have to train clinicians in cultural competence, this idea that you have to understand the culture and the preferences and the background of your patients in a new way. That we have to have more diversity in our clinical environments generally. We have some, and there have been some great efforts by some of the hospitals and healthcare institutions in Boston, but we have to do a lot more. So we have to have this acknowledgement that racism is embedded in the healthcare system, that it's a public health emergency, and then as Daryl and Ann and others have said, we have to act. Enough talk, more action.
Yeah, I think we all agree that underscoring the problem is not enough. And I think that it's really moving into the next steps. But let me bring Malia.
And just one other thing I would say is that, there's a sense in healthcare and other fields that it's too hard or it's going to take too long. In the last month, we've seen this wonderful transformation in healthcare. And so for decades, people said, we can't provide healthcare over avenues like this, like over video, telemedicine, or telephonic. So in the month of February at Blue Cross Blue Shield, we paid every day for about 200 telemedicine visits. By April, we were paying for 40,000 a day. So healthcare changed almost overnight. Let's bring that same urgency to this issue about racism in healthcare. And we know that the COVID epidemic has kind of unmasked something that people in healthcare have known for years, but the public has not been as deeply aware. And so we have a great opportunity here.
No, and because of the fact that it's ground everything to a halt, we have the opportunity to rebuild better. I mean, this is a unique opportunity to accelerate change if we just can muster the will, for sure. It's a unique opportunity. But let me turn it to Malia. Lack of access to banking and capital also drew attention due to COVID, but has persisted for decades and has long-term consequences, especially for Black and Latinx populations trying to build personal wealth and businesses. At the same time, we see more and more financial institutions move into the greater Boston market. What's the disconnect, and how do financial institutions utilize this moment to contribute in a meaningful way?
Thanks, Micho. I think the disconnect is racism. And I think we actually give ourselves a lot more credit around how non-racist we are. The US banking system funded the Triangle Trade Route. It funded slavery. It was the basis, the basis of American capitalism is slavery. Our business is tied to cheap labor. And so when we talk about what the business community can do, I think action, I get nervous as someone who comes out of community organizing because ill-informed action is not helpful. And, I've been sitting in a lot of these panels, as Anna said, and they're the same conversations. And I think for me, what we need to ask, and this is the question I'm asking of the bank, is how do we take responsibility? So I know that I haven't been working at Berkshire Bank for 173 years, but I know 173 years ago, Berkshire banks, different people, as every bank did, right? I know if we go back 300 years, some banks were funding slaves. So how do we actually take that responsibility and not try to assuage our guilt by having conversations in action, but start banking people? If we want to close the wealth gap, if we want to look at that number that we've been saying and wringing our hands about, let's give people mortgages. Let's make sure we get people in banking. And that's what the financial institutions have to do. And I think that, I'm tired of actually hearing about the Boston Globe article and the numbers. What I want to actually hear about are banks making commitments to close that wealth gap by banking the underbanked, by building different relationships. There were very few banks in Boston that at the first round of PPP did non-customers. We were one of the few. And we worked with BECMA and we worked with the LGBTQ chamber the first round, so not the second, but the first round, to make sure that we were bringing minority businesses in. The last thing I will say is that we also have to understand that we're not the same. And so for banks, we need to redefine risk. Because if I use the same risk profile for people who don't have the same opportunity, then I'm actually not giving them a chance to succeed in my bank. And so when you look at changing the way we do underwriting, when you look at the systemic racism Redlining was a partnership of government and banks. These are the things we have to talk about at banks. And as someone who's a woman of color, who runs, the Eastern region, and who comes out of community-based organizations, who comes out of community organizing, I've helped gangs start businesses. I've actually been quite disappointed in the business community response. I think that we're throwing a lot of money at it. I think that we're having a lot of conversations, but I have not seen us make a commitment to actually say by next year, 30% of our vendors are going to be people of color. And I'm willing to sign on to something like that. And I think that's the action that will get me excited. Not how we help change policy, but how we clean our own houses. So learning, listening is a strong action if you've actually had to watch a man be lynched to be motivated. So maybe we do need to listen. Maybe we do need to learn a little more so that our actions follow communities of color and don't try to lead them.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me bring Herbie into the conversation. As a CEO, you've talked about having to expand your business outside of Boston to be able to grow. What's different about the business landscape in Boston, and what can we learn from other places?
Thank you, Michelle. First of all, thank you to Jim and the Chamber for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. Let me put this in context. I'm one to believe that business is personal. Let me be personal. As a Black man living in this country, I'm in fear of my life. I'm in fear of something happened to my two sons. It is outrageous that it took so long for this movement of Black Lives Matter. We in the business community in the Commonwealth need to ask ourselves this question. Do we believe there is a such thing as systematic racism? If we believe there's a systematic racism in our community, in the Commonwealth, then we need to purposefully and passionately do something about it. We can no longer be comfortable until something is done. We can no longer be comfortable when corporate boards have no Black people in it. We can no longer be comfortable when Jim Mooney, in his good heart, tried to increase spending for Black business through the Pacer program. We only have $5 million of spending in 2018. We cannot be comfortable when only 1% of the city of Boston contract spent went to Black women and minority businesses. I know many of us probably saying that we are not comfortable. I will agree with you. But I will also say that we need to be more passionately outraged and passionately committed to do something. We need to be bold in our action as leaders and CEO. We have a model of passionately committed business leaders in our community. I know that I'm going to embarrass him. He committed to have Black people in his board, then he did it. He committed to have diversity in his senior leaders and Black people. He hired a Black president and many other Black senior leaders in his organization. He committed to increase spending with Black business. Guess what? Many Black businesses are doing business with his company. This person is Bob River. Unfortunately, we don't have too many of Bob. This is what I call someone who is passionately outraged and doing something about it. This is how being bold looks like, and this is what commitment looks like. I'm seeing more commitment from other states than in our Commonwealth. At the end of the day, the buck stops with us who lead our companies. I cannot grow my business here because of systematic racism in the Commonwealth at every turn. I grew my business more than tenfold outside the state. This is why we need an organization like BECMA to advocate on behalf of Black business and to hold organizations to their commitment. It is important to know that systematic racism is costly for business. Systematic racism creates an unstable environment and prevent people to thrive. Our purpose is to create a best place for business and people to thrive. I cringe whenever we make this statement because I know that systematic racism is preventing many Black people to thrive. Mitchell.
Painful to hear, but thank you. And you're absolutely right that we need to do a lot more. We hear you. We certainly hear you. Keith, do you want to weigh in as a, I don't see you on the, oh, there you are. As a Black business owner and successful entrepreneur, what message, given all you've heard this morning, would you share with emerging leaders looking to grow and scale their business models during this time?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And at the risk of sounding eerily familiar to what everyone else has said, I think we can all agree that the time for talk is over, right? There are a lot of capable businesses that operate in the Commonwealth that, if given the opportunity, will far exceed expectations. Having said that, I want to speak to the entrepreneurs on the line. I think inherently, the reason why you're an entrepreneur is at your core, you're an optimist. You see opportunity where nobody else does. That's who you are. And there's a redemptive quality in making a choice that you're going to be successful, regardless of the exterior, and just finding your way. Having said that, allow me to be a little bit granular in what we did. As mentioned, my name is Keith Cheney. I am the owner of City Seal Coating. We are a pavement asphalt company located in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So we do everything from paving to line striping to seal coating. So what we did in the very beginning is we reached out to our customers. We wanted to know from them what pre, post, and during COVID looked like for them. Where are their dollars being spent? What challenges do you have? But you also have to be able to be strong enough to know what your value proposition is. What do you offer people? What do you offer your customers that differentiates you from your competition? But you also have to be innovative enough. I think it was Henry Ford that said, hey, if he listened to his customers, he would be just simply building faster horses right now, right? So you have to be innovative enough to be 2 steps ahead of your customers. And that's something that we took very seriously. So we've differentiated ourselves in this environment. And for the entrepreneurs of the line, that's what you have to do, is create your value proposition and differentiate yourself. So what did we learn during this process? We learned that a lot of capital projects were either canceled or postponed. And that helped to inform our strategic goals after that. That meant that our customers needed options. They needed to know that if given this very tight environment, if they're not able to do these large projects, where can they find options? And for us, on a very granular level, that means that as opposed to repaving an entire parking lot, give us options. Can we patch and then seal coat the rest of it? And is that a service that you provide? And so for us, not only did we want to make sure that our customers understood that we knew what they were going through, but we also wanted to reach out to large paving companies, make them aware of our existence, and from there, give them options of our services as well.
Thank you. And what, as an active member of the Merrimack Valley, and given your experience working in a gateway city, what challenges do you see for Black and minority businesses working outside of Boston?
Each hope you broke up a bit, but here's what I will say is, so I purchased this business 3 years ago, and I knew just personally that I had to be in a place that was familiar to where I grew up. I grew up in the Bronx and was lucky enough to make my way to Massachusetts via athletics. And I wanted to be in a place in which we can be the most impactful. So we came to Lawrence by design. Lawrence is one of these cities that has an incredible amount of talent, just oftentimes it's overlooked. And I can say in my 3 years here that we've been fully accepted and can't be happy with our decision to be here, right? If we're gonna hire people from a community, we wanna hire people that we know that it's gonna change their lives. Having access to jobs, to capital. I've often said to people that, you know, if given an opportunity, if a person knows that they have something to lose, they're gonna make the right decision. And so we're very keen in our business to make sure that each one of the people that we hire are from this community and that they know that they're part of our success. What I will say to businesses outside of the Merrimack Valley or outside of gateway cities is whether it's through your hiring practices or your procurement practices, and I'm gonna echo what Herbie has said here, you know, oftentimes we have a credibility gap, but there are really capable companies inside of gateway cities. They're dynamic, they are talented. And if you are going to be successful in actually following up with what you've decided to do during and post these times in which we can absolutely change, there are opportunities outside of just Boston, Massachusetts. There's some really great companies here. So my final statement on that would simply be is that if you're looking to do that, don't be precluded by your geographic area. Move beyond Boston, Massachusetts, and you'll find some really dynamic people here to which you can partner with.
Thank you for that, Keith. And let me bring Glenn into the conversation. The invisibility of Black people that Lee talked about shows up not only in lack of diversity in hiring and board seats, but also in gaining access to the needed capital, capacity building support, and contracts to grow their businesses. Through your work in the Foundation for Business Equity, you've been continuously highlighting this. What are the opportunities that you see now with this heightened awareness among financial institutions and corporations, and what are some of the immediate actions that should be taken?
Thanks, Micho. In fact, first, let me just do a shout out to my Black panelists who, this is not always easy for us to get out here and kind of bare our souls in this very emotional time, in all honesty. So thanks for, kind of teeing this up a little bit for what I'm about to say. I want to start with on a thread that kind of Malia started with, which is, I think the folks, either some of us on the panel and many of us watching, are really part of the corporate power system. And so we just, and I think this is a time for us to be reflective. Like, where do we sit kind of in this conversation? And even to Ron Hanley's, words earlier, he said himself, this cannot go any longer. This is our problem to solve. And so I want to start by saying we need to get out of our comfort zones and be bold. I mean, this is a movement that's happening across the globe, and it starts again. Some earlier folks said is by understanding that the lynching of George Floyd is a culmination of history of this country that we already know. It was built on Black free labor that not only enriched this country but also enriched the Western Hemisphere. And so I guess I'd say some of us are gatekeepers to this power system. And so what's our role? And I think I really want to push us to really answer that question. Now, to your question, I think when it comes to small business, we know that there's certain tools that are very essential for growth. And it's advice and it's experience. I call them the power tools, right? It's access to customers. And we see the chat going on with the pace setters that we need to really boost up. And Herbie mentioned that. But to me, it's most importantly, it's capital. Capital is power. And how do we get growth capital into the hands of our Black and Latino and entrepreneurs and folks who've been kind of left out of the system? And that's all of our challenges. And so I want to echo a couple of things that Lee said earlier, which is there has been an ecosystem building here in Boston. I'm actually kind of proud of it. Not fast enough, and many in this panel working together on it, and who else are in the chat room. And so I think we want to figure out, how do we look at that? This is not about false solutions. This is about the stuff that's really working, and then build on those. And that's all of our responsibility.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn, for that. And let me go to Gary. As we move forward with all of this work to close racial equity gaps in hiring and leadership, contracting, healthcare, and company cultures, we also know the images that we show in the media and the messages that we convey as business leaders are just as important. As our country has become younger and more diverse, P&G has embraced this by investing in brands like Walker & Company, which was founded by a Black man and designed for people of color. And Gillette has run a number of marketing campaigns over the past couple of years that embrace social issues, like the Best a Man Can Be campaign. Would you talk a bit about the importance of investing in brands and companies like Walker & Company?
Yes, thank you, Micho. And let me start by also thanking some of the panelists who spoke with such passion about the very grave issues that we face here. And, I will say that, in my view, it's no longer appropriate for the burden of addressing these grave issues to fall on the most marginalized in our society. And it is time for everybody to act. We are all in this together, and we have to act. Yes, we came together with Tristan Walker and his enterprise. He's a great business leader. He created a beautiful company, designing and selling products across the US, designed for people of color. And it was a natural fit for us to come together, and we were very pleased to invest in that business. But your question highlights something that has cropped up 2 or 3 times in the discussion already, and it is important that businesses and business leaders make an effort to invest in minority-owned businesses. Herbie mentioned it, I think Glyn did as well. We have a pace setters program that the Chamber initiated. The Gillette company, P&G, has been proud participants in that, but I don't think we've done enough. And I don't think collectively we've done enough in that program. And we need to do more. We will do more, but we collectively need to do more. You know, attending a conference like this, a discussion like this is of course a good start. It's wonderful that so many people are listening. But for those of you out there who control businesses and can make a difference, there's a very good practical way to move good intentions to action. The Pacesetters program does help minority-owned businesses in our region.
Thank you for that. And let me bring in Paul before we go to the audience questions. In addition to serving as chair of the chamber, you've been president of the board of the Real Estate Finance Association, Paul, a trade group for the commercial real estate industry, an industry not known as being a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Would you share some of the work that took place during your tenure, and what are some of the lessons that we can apply to other industries?
Sure, Micho. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge all that has been said. I just want to acknowledge that this is our collective problem. It's pervasive, it's pernicious, and we need seismic cultural change and accountability. I do think conversations like this are important, but only if and when they lead to accountable action. So I just want to acknowledge all that has been said and reinforce it with an exclamation mark. So I was president of the board of the Real Estate Finance Association, which has about 700 members. And the year before I was the president of it, or a couple of years before, we developed a nominating and governance committee. There were of a board of 36, there were 5 women and 1 person of color. And we led an effort to diversify it. Now, what's important is that people said, well, you will never diversify it because you won't find the people in the commercial real estate industry. And that's because people were looking inside and not outside. And people were looking at people they knew versus people they might not have known or been comfortable with. So to fast forward, currently, 3 years later, we have a board of 36 and 45% of that board is women, 30% are of color. When we're in the room, the conversations, you can just imagine, are very different. Our membership has grown. Our corporate sponsorships have grown. If one needs to make the business case for it, but what I want to make is the real case of change for it. What we've done now, in addition to having a board that is different and more diverse, we measure what we're doing. So how many of the panels are diverse? How many of our members are diverse? How much of the staff is diverse? We adopted, remarkably, among all of the groups within the Greater Boston Real Estate Board, and now we're one of 5 divisions, they've all adopted it, a statement of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, a statement is words. It doesn't mean anything unless you adhere to it and you measure it and you count it. And that's what we have been doing. And we also recognize that to continue to foster diversity, you need 2 things. You need to bring more people in. So we've developed an emerging leaders program, which is 250 of our 700 plus members. And we developed a mentorship program to mentor younger members of the industry and bring them up. We also have organized with all of the, I think there's 7 other real estate trade groups in the region, a DEI summit. I think this next week will be the 2nd or 3rd annual of those. And we've brought the leaders of those groups together to talk about what we can collectively do. For example, how we can share in mentoring. It's not one trade group versus this is a social issue, this is a community issue, this is a country issue. And so we need to deal with it collectively. And we've tried to break down the barriers of even the different groups. And in addition to that, our programming has focused on these issues as well. So we measure ourselves, we hold ourselves accountable. And of all of the groups I've been involved in, some of the most powerful conversations recently have been with this group. I just want to pivot though and talk about something else that was said here, which is Andrew mentioned healthcare. And I just want to touch on that for a moment because the diversity in healthcare. You may also know another group that I'm involved with is St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. I'm vice chair of the National Board of Directors. And many years ago, when that was founded, opened its doors in 1962. It's in Memphis, Tennessee. And it was placed in Memphis, Tennessee by Danny Thomas, and my father actually had the privilege of being one of the founding directors with him. I mention it because everyone knows it is maybe the largest healthcare nonprofit in the country currently. But when it opened its doors to treat kids with cancer and other catastrophic diseases, one of the guiding principles was that no one would be charged. All care would be provided free of care, as well as lodging and transportation. And it was put in the Mid-South because it would be the first fully integrated hospital in the Mid-South, because when Danny Thomas was traveling the country, he read an article about how a white driver had hit a black child on a bike, and he took him to 2 hospitals that rejected him. And on the way to the 3rd hospital, this child died. And Danny Thomas kept that article, and the pledge he made to himself was to do what he, as one person, could do to make a bold step for integration against racism. And fast forward, and a leading publication just 10 years ago, a study came out, and only St. Jude could have done this, where it showed that the cure rate of children of all races is equal when you remove the variables of the socioeconomic and racial socioeconomic variables. And we could only done that because there is no cost associated with care. So that's a bold move that one person took that changed at least one region in this country. I offer that because we're talking about action. And that's an action. And I think when we come to the latter part of the program, you're going to ask us, what are the bold actions? That was a bold action, and one inspiring one that one person could do that all these years later has made a difference. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Let's turn to audience questions. And we have a question for all of the panelists. And I want to make sure that we stress how we remove barriers here in our answers. But Carol Copeland Thomas asks, what can we do to ensure accountability measures are in place? Who would like to take that?
Micho, this is Lee. I have to say something, and I wanted to say it in this setting because, you know, I taught English and American literature, and I also taught languages when I was a professor. And I must say that using the word minority is a misrepresentation because Black and brown folks are not the minority in this world. We are the majority. And so when I hear phrases like, this is a minority majority city or minority majority school system, that's, you know, that doesn't make any sense to me. It does, and so I wish that we could, you know, I wish that we could calibrate our language and line it up with reality. And when we don't, to me, that's another example of how this structural racism is embedded in our everyday lives. And in this case, embedded in the way we address people and think about people.
Thank you for that, Lee. Language is important, and I thank you for that. Point well taken. Does anybody want to take Carol's question about
what was the question, Micho?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
What can we do to ensure that accountability measures are in place?
Oh, I'd love to take that question and talk a little bit about what we're doing. Accountability, you know, and I know why we want action and we're using that word, but action during flashpoints aren't plans. So the question of accountability becomes very, very important. And I think one, you need to actually tie it into your business model. So it's great to give from your foundation. That's awesome. Foundations aren't getting people into mainstream economies. Grants actually keep people tied to need grants. And so tying things to your business, are you helping Black people get jobs? Are you helping brown women get jobs? You know, we heard, I think it was Ron who said something, you know, about the importance of small minority businesses because they hire people. Well, with all the corporate tax support and government support, maybe corporations should also be known for hiring, just like the post office, right? Just like IBM was in creating a Black middle class. So making it a part of your business model is how you will hold it accountable. I know for us, we do charity, but a majority of what I try to do has to do with sales, because in capitalism, that's what people like. So I think the first thing is finding ways to hold yourself accountable to the idea so that your business is actually tied to it. And the second thing is to have self-reflective conversations. A lot of times people of color and white people might not have the same conversations that people of color have when we're together. And that's about trust. That's about feeling comfortable that you're not going to be retaliated against or that you will not be judged. But so as a white person who's looking to be an ally, I think one of the best ways to hold accountable is to have honest conversations. And so if a lot of people of color are telling you you're awesome, you might not be having honest conversations. And, find people who will tell you about your own internal bias and how you may be supporting the white supremacist structure. And so having those places of personal accountability, not from someone who works for you, not from someone who you give money to in a foundation, but someone who will honestly tell you how they think you show up as a white person is very important as well.
Well said, Malia. Anybody else want to weigh in?
Actually, if I could just jump in quickly, and I think it's a couple of things. First, it starts by you don't change behavior unless you measure it. And so I know when we've referenced the spotlight, the Globe, a couple years back now, and they asked, corporate Boston and Massachusetts what their numbers were in terms of diversity employment, and only 3 responses, and one of them was the Globe. So I think if this is a chamber event, I think it starts here. And so what is your numbers? So let's put a metric up, and then let's set some goals, maybe some stretch goals. Let's look at it at every level of your organization, from front entry all the way to management, all the way up. Let's set some goals today. And then we hold each other accountable to achieving these goals. And maybe that's a third party or what have you that's really looking at and saying, okay, we're working together to actually change. That's just one example on the employment. So we can do that across the board on all the pieces of the ecosystem.
Let's
Marianne. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with what we measure gets done for sure. But I also think it's about having open dialogue as well, and making sure that people are talking about experiences and what offends people, and being very open and honest, and having those conversations really helps us to be better as an organization, and make sure that we're not tolerating any racism whatsoever. And having those discussions really help on that front as well.
Another question from Sarah Mahoney. Curious to hear the group's perspective on candidate pipelining when companies are not hiring. How do we make progress then? Any thoughts on that?
I think that is a challenge coming from a big organization. And Ron mentioned it earlier at State Street, they haven't really moved their numbers much. Their numbers have stayed pretty much the same. And I think that's very similar to a lot of large companies. I think what we need to do is make sure that we are developing the people that we have in the organization as well, and making sure that we make opportunities and pathways and career opportunities for the people that we have in the organization. And that whenever we are hiring, that we got to make sure that we have a diverse candidate slate. And we shouldn't accept it unless we do hit certain targets in terms of diversity on our candidate slates and the people that we're hiring. But I think a lot of that for companies that aren't increasing the pipeline is what can we do to develop the people that we already have.
Micho, I'd add on to that too, and that is that if companies say they're not hiring because of COVID-19, it's a cop-out. People are moving around, people are retiring, maybe the numbers of hiring are down, but nonetheless, hiring is taking place. And so we do need to be held accountable. And I love what Glenn said just a few minutes ago about putting our D&I plans out there. John Farina said it in a meeting yesterday. Yeah. He's going to put PwC's D&I plan out for public, and he wants to be held accountable to it. We're going to do the same thing to National Grid. We have to. And I want you to know what our numbers are. And I talked about mediocre diversity numbers earlier. They are mediocre. So we can't continue to settle where we all think we've been comfortable before. So challenge all of my business colleagues on this call to, show us your goods. And I'll put mine out and we'll be embarrassed by it. But that's how we're going to improve it, by measuring it.
Mitra, I just want to add, first of all, I agree with Marianne in terms of making sure our own houses are Marcia, our own houses are in order, and making sure that the people we have in our organizations are getting the training and mentoring so they can be the strongest that they can be. But the second thing is we are going to hire eventually. And so I'm a partner now on the executive committee of Nutter. We still have the opportunity to talk to those folks, know who they are. And so when we're hiring, they'll know us and we'll know them. So this should not stop simply because there's not an act to be taken immediately to hire. The act is to be known and be heard and get them to know us and maybe help them develop. So I think the question actually sort of shakes me a bit. I know it's meant in a good way, but that can't be a reason not to keep the intensity on this effort.
I also want to say that hiring can be fraught. If your culture is not ready to receive diversity, you may actually be doing yourself a disservice. If you think of some of the companies like Google, we saw this in Silicon Valley a lot where folks ran out to get diversity, but they weren't ready for what people of color were saying once they got in there, because the culture was actually what was making people of color not feel comfortable. And so when you look at hiring and retaining talent, I think it's really important to know that you actually have to shift the culture that wasn't hiring and retaining talent before you hire and retain talent.
I really agree with what Malia just said. And this is where inclusion comes in. So we talk a lot about diversity and representation, which is critical, but really creating an inclusive culture where it's open and people feel safe and they can speak up, back to Marianne's point about dialogue. And there are ways to measure that kind of culture in your organization. And I encourage people to take advantage of that and do it. You'll learn a lot.
Shifting to another question from Elizabeth, it seems like the cure that you talked about will potentially take decades to see real and sustainable change. What practical steps can citizens of Boston take now that will start to make change, and how should we begin to measure that change? So this is Anna. The problem didn't occur overnight, so it's not going to be an overnight change. I did want to just read something and add a little bit of data in here. It was a Boston Globe article recently, and the interview was the PwC chairman. And in that article, it said, while Blacks make up 10% of all college graduates, there are only 4 Black CEOs in Fortune 500 companies. And that's fewer than the number of Black CEOs 10 years ago. Only 3.2% of executives and senior managers, 3.2% of executives and senior managers in Fortune 500 companies are Blacks. So the numbers don't lie, and I think it's, I'm speaking to everyone on the call, especially our allies, if we are going to care, we can't just care with our feelings. Like Malia said, we have to be held accountable. And I think of care as being, one, I'm going to say commit to change, commit to ending inequities. A in the care is for action and accountability. The R is for rectify. Go back and look at your organization and look at your boards and look at your senior leadership and rectify if you see there are issues there by sponsoring and mentoring and advancing those people of color that are in your organization. And lastly, but not least, the E, put a strategic plan in place and execute it. Execute it and look at the number and the data, and like I said, it's not going to happen overnight, but we're hoping that the change will be imminent.
And can I just add to that quick, Mitra, so for the business leaders that are on the line, they've all agreed that we need to diversify our procurement goals, right? It's one thing to say that you want to do it. It's something very different for that to be actionable in your organizations. So realize that once you've made that edict, that we have to get through as a business owner, that there's levels of jello that we have to get through in order to make that happen. So that means that not only do you have to say that out loud, but you have to be able to communicate that internally. Because Pacesetters, for a perfect example, there are many companies that are on this Pacesetters list that have said, yes, we want to procure with diverse companies. It makes sense at every level. but when it comes actionable, and I know that it's just not me, but so far, so we are a company that probably I think is the 5th largest in the state. We've gotten $0 from Pacesetters. Full stop, 0. If you're on Pacesetters list, no procurement has happened. So it's great that you've talked about it, but you have to get us through the jello. And we are not talking about handouts. We are capable, we are actionable, but we need you to push it through your organization in a way in which hasn't happened in the past.
Herbie, as we wrap up, let me turn to you. You've participated in a number of conversations like this with us. And as Jim mentioned at the beginning, we're already familiar with many of these and other proposed solutions. What are your thoughts on this moment? And what would make this feel that it's different from other times?
Thank you again, Micho. I will say my thoughts are work with the Black advocate business like BECMA, whose job is to advocate for Black businesses to hold business accountable. My firm will be making a major announcement next week to support BECMA. And I also, even as small as I am, also be a sponsor of an organization like Get Connected, founded by many of you know, by Colette Phillip, who is one of the most influential Black women in the Commonwealth. And I think the urgency of now required us to act by having Black people, and especially Black women on your board, hire Black people at executive and senior level, increase spending of contract with Black business. We have many Black companies, and I'm one of them, and you know many of them, hold people accountable and tie performance and bonus to the outcome. Finally, I believe change starts from the top. If we don't do these and more, we will be irrelevant in the fight of racial justice for Black people in America.
Thank you for that. And let me turn it over to Jim, but first let me thank all of you and tell you certainly that as the first Latina chairman of the chamber as I come in, I am very much, not only that, but the first immigrant to chair the chamber. I understand the power of economic opportunity firsthand. I saw it with my family and my story, and I'm committed to action. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you in the months ahead, and turn it over to Jim.
Well, thank you, Micho, and let me echo Micho's gratitude to everyone who participated in this very rich conversation. I want to thank people for the shout out of the Pacesetters program. I would agree that it is it's a strong infrastructure. It's a strong skeletal system. Now's the time to put some muscle on it. And I look forward to working with all of our businesses in the chamber in doing that. As I said at the beginning, in my conversations previous to this and today, I heard a lot about listening and learning and speaking out in action. I heard about let's not celebrate efforts that are already going on. It's not enough. I heard about metrics. I think my big word of the day is and. I don't think it's either or. I think it is listening and learning and speaking out and acting and celebrating efforts that are going on, and being willing to admit that it's not enough, and being willing to measure with transparency. So I think I'd like to embrace the word and for the day in terms of all of what is necessary. And in closing, I've said this before, business leaders, community leaders, residents, we all must strive to create an equitable society where people of all racial backgrounds can economically thrive, and as our Constitution tells us, engage in their pursuit of happiness and live without fear and violence. And the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce is committed to that ideal. Once again, thank you all to our panelists. Thank you all for joining us. This concludes our session today.